There are people in the galaxy you admire, people you fear, and then there is the one you are forbidden to touch. The grand diplomatic chamber of Orion Gate shimmered beneath a ceiling of transparent alloy, where distant stars glowed like cold lanterns across the void. Delegations from 12 worlds filled the circular hall, their voices low and cautious, the air heavy with the quiet tension that always followed the arrival of royalty. At the center of the chamber stood Princess Lyra Virith of the Aurelian Empire, tall and impossibly still, her luminous turquoise skin reflecting the soft silver light that spilled from the ceiling above. She looked almost carved from starlight itself, elegant and distant, with long strands of pale metallic hair resting across the shoulders of her ceremonial robes. Around her, the floor remained strangely empty. No one stood within 10 feet of the princess. No guard stepped close. No diplomat offered the customary greeting. Even the station's advanced service drones stopped short of crossing the invisible boundary surrounding her. Everyone in the room understood the reason, even if no one dared speak it aloud. The Aurelian royal bloodline carried a rare biological phenomenon, a field of unstable neuroenergy that reacted violently to physical contact. It was not a weapon, not something the princess controlled, but it had shaped her entire life. In crowded halls, people kept their distance. At state ceremonies, ambassadors bowed from afar. Even her own attendants used hovering tools instead of their hands. The galaxy had given her a quiet title whispered across diplomatic channels and starship corridors alike, the untouchable princess. Lyra had long since learned to stand without reaching for support, to walk without brushing against anyone, to exist inside an invisible circle of empty space that followed her everywhere she went. She carried herself with practiced calm, chin high, posture perfect, though somewhere deep beneath the royal composure lived a loneliness few could imagine. Across the chamber, a maintenance hatch slid open with a hydraulic hiss that most diplomats barely noticed. A man stepped through carrying a compact toolkit and a battered diagnostic tablet tucked beneath one arm. Ethan Carter looked nothing like the elegant envoys surrounding him. His station uniform was dark gray, sleeves rolled to the elbows, the fabric marked with faint streaks of machine grease earned from hours spent inside ventilation shafts and maintenance conduits. Ethan wasn't here for politics. He was here because a sensor in the ceremonial chamber's environmental system had started glitching 20 minutes earlier, and the station computer had routed the repair request to the closest available technician. He glanced down at his tablet while walking forward, scanning lines of code that flickered across the screen. Temperature variance. Field interference. Probably a misaligned emitter panel somewhere in the ceiling grid. Just another routine job on a station that orbited 500,000 miles above Earth. Ethan barely looked up as he stepped into the open floor of the chamber, unaware that dozens of alien diplomats had just fallen silent. Their eyes followed the human technician with growing disbelief as he unknowingly crossed the invisible boundary that every other being in the room had carefully avoided. 10 feet from the princess. 8 feet. 6. Lyra noticed him then. Her luminous eyes shifted toward the approaching human, curiosity replacing the distant calm she usually wore in public. No fear touched her expression, only quiet surprise. The human kept walking, still studying the diagnostic readout in his hand, completely unaware that he was approaching the one person in the galaxy no one dared touch. The silence in the chamber spread outward like a ripple through still water as Ethan Carter walked forward without the slightest awareness that every pair of alien eyes had locked onto him. The representatives from the outer systems had spent years studying the customs of the Aurelian Empire, and each of them knew exactly what the human technician was about to do. One of the insectoid diplomats shifted uneasily in his seat. A tall silver-skinned ambassador leaned closer to his companion and whispered something in a low voice. None of them stepped forward to stop the human. They simply watched. Ethan stopped a few feet from the princess and finally looked up from his tablet. The first thing he noticed was the light. Up close, Princess Lyra seemed to glow faintly, her turquoise skin reflecting the overhead starlight in a way that looked almost unreal. For a brief moment, he wondered if he had walked into the wrong room. This did not look like a maintenance corridor. This looked like the center of some kind of royal ceremony. Ethan blinked once and glanced around the chamber. Dozens of diplomats stood frozen, staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to quiet. Alarm. Ethan frowned slightly and scratched the back of his neck. While that was awkward, he looked back at his tablet, then at the ceiling panel above the princess where a flickering indicator light confirmed the system error he had been sent to fix. Of course, the malfunctioning emitter would be located directly above the one person standing in the middle of the room. Just my luck, he muttered quietly to himself. Princess Lyra had not moved. She watched the human technician with calm curiosity, her luminous eyes studying the strange confidence of someone who clearly had no idea who she was. Most beings approached her with caution, careful to remain far beyond the invisible boundary surrounding her. This human had walked straight through it, as if it did not exist. Ethan stepped a little closer and pointed toward the ceiling panel. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I just need to fix the environmental emitter above you. It is throwing off the station sensors." The translation systems embedded in the chamber walls converted his English into the diplomatic language of the Aurelian court. Several diplomats inhaled quietly. The princess tilted her head slightly, studying the human in front of her. No one had ever spoken to her in quite that tone before. There was no fear in his voice, no ceremony, just the straightforward focus of someone trying to finish a repair job. "You should remain where you are," the princess said calmly. Her voice was clear and musical, carrying easily through the chamber. The human paused, looking mildly puzzled. "Remain where I am." "Yes," she said. "Do not come closer." Ethan glanced again at the emitter panel above her head. Then he looked at the empty floor surrounding her, noticing for the first time how no one else stood nearby. Something about the scene finally felt unusual. Still, the repair indicator on his tablet continued flashing red. The station systems expected this problem to be fixed before the next environmental cycle in 20 minutes. Ethan sighed quietly and adjusted the strap on his toolkit. "I promise this will only take about 30 seconds, he said. The princess watched him carefully. "Human," she said softly, "it would be wise for you to stop walking." Ethan gave a small apologetic smile and took another step forward. The moment Ethan Carter took that step, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. The faint glow surrounding Princess Lyra shimmered softly in the starlight above them, a delicate field of energy that had shaped every moment of her life since childhood. To the diplomats watching from the outer ring of the hall, the invisible boundary around her was as real as any wall. For years they had observed the rule without question. No one approached the princess. No one crossed the empty circle surrounding her. Yet the human technician continued forward with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the only danger in the room was a faulty environmental emitter. Ethan glanced once more at the blinking warning icon on his tablet. The diagnostic display scrolled through lines of data that meant far more to him than the silent tension spreading across the chamber. A misaligned field regulator, probably caused by the station drifting a fraction of an inch during the last orbital adjustment. It was the sort of problem that happened every week on Orion Gate. Fix the panel, recalibrate the emitter, move on to the next job. Simple. The princess studied him carefully. The human stood less than 4 feet away now, close enough that she could see the faint scuffs on his station boots and the small scar across his left eyebrow. No one had stood this near to her in years. Even her own attendants used hovering instruments rather than risk contact. Yet this human remained completely calm, his attention divided between the flickering tablet in his hand and the ceiling panel above her head. "Human," Lyra said again, her voice softer this time. "You do not understand the danger." Ethan looked up from the screen and met her gaze. For a brief moment, he forgot about the malfunctioning emitter entirely. Her eyes were remarkable, bright and luminous like reflected sunlight on deep water. "Danger," he repeated with mild confusion. "The only dangerous thing up there is a misbehaving regulator coil." The princess tilted her head slightly. Her long metallic hair shifted across her shoulder like threads of pale silver. "If you come any closer," she said quietly, "you may be harmed." Around them several diplomats shifted uneasily. One of the Aurelian guards took a cautious step forward before another guard placed a restraining hand on his arm. Everyone knew that interfering now might make the situation worse. The human was already too close. Ethan followed her gaze, briefly, noticing how every alien in the room seemed to be watching them. The tension in the air was thick enough to feel. He exhaled slowly and offered the princess a small apologetic smile. "Look," I do not want to interrupt whatever royal meeting is happening here, he said, but the station computer will keep sending error alerts until that panel is fixed. If I take care of it quickly, you can get back to whatever important diplomatic things you were doing. Lyra watched him with growing curiosity. Most beings treated her presence like standing beside a storm cloud. They moved carefully, respectfully, always aware of the invisible energy field surrounding her body. This human behaved as if she were simply another person standing beneath a broken ceiling panel. Ethan stepped closer again, raising his eyes toward the emitter above. The distance between them narrowed to barely 3 feet. The faint glow surrounding the princess pulsed softly, reacting to his proximity in a way that none of the observers could fully predict. The princess inhaled slowly. "Human," she said once more, almost gently now. "This is your final warning." Ethan nodded absent-mindedly, while pulling a small diagnostic tool from his kit. "I appreciate the concern," he replied, "but I promise I will be careful." Then he reached upward toward the ceiling panel directly above her head, unaware that he had just stepped fully inside the invisible boundary that no one in the galaxy dared cross. For a fraction of a second, the entire diplomatic chamber seemed to freeze in time as Ethan Carter reached upward toward the flickering emitter panel. His fingers brushed the edge of the metal casing while the diagnostic tool in his other hand hummed softly, scanning the faulty regulator coil hidden behind the ceiling plate. To Ethan, it was just another repair job. To everyone else in the room, it looked like the beginning of a moment no one had ever witnessed before. Princess Lyra did not step away. She remained perfectly still beneath the broken emitter, her luminous eyes fixed on the human standing within arm's reach. The faint halo of energy surrounding her body pulsed gently, a subtle shimmer in the air that only the station sensors could normally detect. It was the same field that had forced every being in her life to keep their distance. Guards, advisors, ambassadors, even members of her own court. For as long as she could remember, people had learned to speak to her from across empty rooms. Yet the human technician standing beside her behaved as though the invisible barrier meant nothing at all. Ethan carefully removed a small access latch from the panel and leaned slightly closer to examine the internal wiring. A tiny spark of pale light flickered along the edge of the regulator coil. "There it is," he murmured quietly to himself. "Just a loose alignment bracket. 30 seconds, tops." The princess watched his hands move with steady confidence. He did not hesitate. He did not pull away. Even now he showed no sign of fear, no awareness that the air around her carried a charge capable of overwhelming most nervous systems. Her voice came softly again, though this time it carried something different beneath the calm warning. "Human." Ethan glanced down toward her with a polite smile, while still holding the panel open above them. "Yes, Your Highness. You truly do not understand what you are standing inside." Ethan looked briefly around the empty circle surrounding them, then back at her. He shrugged lightly. "I understand that this emitter panel has been throwing error codes for the last 20 minutes, and the station computer refuses to stop complaining about it. That is the only problem I am focused on right now." A faint murmur spread across the distant ring of diplomats. The human's calm persistence had turned the entire chamber into an audience holding its breath. Lyra felt the familiar tension of her energy field respond to his presence. Normally, when anyone approached this close, the invisible charge around her skin intensified almost immediately. It was an instinctive reaction built deep within her biology. Yet something about the human standing beside her felt strangely different. The energy did not surge the way it usually did. Instead, the faint glow surrounding her seemed to ripple gently, almost as if the field itself were uncertain. Ethan finished tightening the alignment bracket and closed the panel with a soft metallic click. The diagnostic tool in his hand emitted a quiet chime. Problem solved. He looked down at his tablet and nodded with quiet satisfaction as the error message disappeared from the display. "There we go. System stable again." Ethan lowered his arm and finally noticed just how close he was standing to the princess. Barely 2 feet separated them now. The faint glow in the air between them shimmered softly like heat above warm pavement. For the first time, Ethan hesitated slightly. "That glow," he said slowly. "Is that supposed to be happening?" Lyra studied him in silence. No one in the chamber moved. The invisible energy field surrounding her pulsed once more, gentle and uncertain, as if reacting to something it had never encountered before. And for the first time in many years, the princess wondered if the human standing beside her might already have crossed a boundary that no one else in the galaxy had ever dared to reach. The faint glow in the air lingered between them like heat rising from sun-warmed pavement, subtle but unmistakable, and Ethan Carter slowly lowered the diagnostic tool in his hand as he studied it with mild curiosity. He had worked on dozens of stations across the inner systems, and he had seen plenty of strange technologies, but the soft shimmer surrounding Princess Lyra did not look like any malfunction he had ever repaired. It looked alive, almost like the air itself was breathing. Ethan glanced back down at his tablet to confirm the emitter readings. Environmental systems stable. Power grid balanced. Radiation levels normal. Whatever that glow was, it definitely was not coming from the station. He looked up again and gave the princess a small, uncertain smile. "I promise that panel is fixed now," he said calmly. "If something else is glowing in here, it is not my fault." The princess did not answer right away. Her luminous eyes remained locked on the human standing in front of her, studying him with the same careful focus that scholars used when examining something completely new. For most of her life, every person who stepped within 10 feet of her had reacted the same way. Their bodies would tense. Their nervous systems would recoil. The unstable bioelectric field surrounding her would surge instinctively, pushing them back before contact could ever happen. It was not something she controlled. It was simply how her body existed. Yet the human technician standing 2 feet away showed none of those reactions. The energy field around her pulsed again, faint and uncertain, as if searching for the response it expected but could not find. Ethan noticed the silence spreading through the chamber behind him. Slowly he turned his head and finally took in the full view of the diplomatic hall. Dozens of alien delegates stood in a wide circle around the two of them, every eye fixed on the invisible boundary he had just crossed without realizing it. A tall Aurelian guard held his position near the outer ring of the chamber, clearly ready to intervene, but unwilling to step forward. Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly. "Okay," he said slowly. "I feel like I just walked into the middle of something important." The princess exhaled softly, a slow, controlled breath that barely disturbed the faint glow around her shoulders. "You did more than walk into it, human," she said quietly. "You walked somewhere no one else is allowed to stand." Ethan looked down at the empty floor surrounding them and then back at her. "Well, nobody told me that before I started fixing the ceiling." A faint ripple of disbelief passed through several diplomats watching from the edge of the chamber. The calm simplicity of the human's response seemed almost unreal compared to the centuries of caution that had surrounded the Aurelian royal line. Lyra studied his face again, searching for signs of fear or tension. She found none, only quiet patience and the faint curiosity of someone trying to understand an unusual situation. Slowly, almost cautiously, the princess lifted her hand a few inches from her side. The energy field shimmered faintly around her fingers, a gentle wave of light spreading through the air. "Human," she said softly, "if you remain here much longer, something may happen that neither of us expects." Ethan glanced at the faint glow around her hand and tilted his head slightly. "Then maybe we should find out what that something is," he replied. "Because right now, it looks like the only person in this entire station who is not afraid of you is the guy who came here to fix the ceiling." The quiet confidence in Ethan Carter's voice seemed to ripple through the chamber almost as strongly as the faint energy field surrounding Princess Lyra. For a moment no one moved. The diplomats along the outer ring exchanged uncertain glances, each of them silently wondering if the human technician truly understood what he had just said. The only being who did not look confused was the princess herself. Lyra watched him carefully, her luminous eyes reflecting the soft starlight overhead as the glow around. Her hand shimmered like pale water. In all her years, she had never heard anyone speak about her condition so casually. Most people lowered their voices around her. Some spoke with careful reverence. Others avoided speaking at all. This human had simply treated her like someone standing beneath a broken ceiling panel. Slowly, the princess lifted her hand a little higher. The energy field reacted immediately, faint arcs of light moving gently through the air around her fingers. It was not a violent reaction. It was more like a quiet pulse, a reminder of the strange biological force that surrounded her body at all times. "Human," she said softly, If you truly are not afraid, you should understand something first. Ethan adjusted the strap of his toolkit on his shoulder and looked at the glowing air around her hand with mild curiosity. I am listening. For as long as I have lived, Lyra continued, no one has been able to stand this close to me. When they try, their nervous systems react to the energy field around my body. Their instincts force them to step away before contact can occur. Ethan tilted his head slightly. That sounds inconvenient. A faint ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the watching diplomats. The princess blinked once, clearly not expecting that answer. Yes, she said after a moment. It is inconvenient. Ethan glanced again at the glow surrounding her fingers. The light pulsed softly, like a distant heartbeat inside the air. But it is not hurting me, he said calmly. Lyra studied his face again, searching for any sign of discomfort. There was none. If anything, the human looked more curious than concerned. That is precisely the mystery, she replied quietly. Ethan shifted his weight slightly and leaned forward a fraction of an inch, studying the field more closely. The faint glow reflected in his brown eyes as if it were simply another interesting piece of technology waiting to be understood. Around them, the chamber remained silent. Several Aurelian guards watched with rigid attention, their hands resting near their equipment but making no move to intervene. They had been trained for years to protect the princess from danger. None of their training included instructions for what to do if someone simply ignored the danger entirely. Ethan looked back at Lyra and gave a small, thoughtful nod. So everyone else gets a warning from their nerves and backs away. But I do not feel anything like that. Correct, the princess said. Which means either you are unusually calm or your biology reacts differently to my energy field. Ethan considered that for a moment. Then he shrugged lightly. Humans do a lot of things differently from the rest of the galaxy. Lyra watched him for another long second. Then slowly, cautiously, she extended her hand a little farther toward him. The glow around her fingers brightened slightly, spreading through the air between them like a gentle wave of light. If what you say is true, she said softly, then you are standing closer to me than anyone else has in many years. Ethan glanced down at the hand reaching toward him and then back at her eyes. His voice remained calm. Well, if that is the case, he said quietly, then we might as well see what happens next. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The entire diplomatic chamber remained silent as the princess's hand hovered in the glowing air between them, the faint shimmer of her energy field flowing around her fingers like pale mist. Every diplomat in the room watched with quiet tension, aware that they were witnessing something that had never happened before in the long history of the Aurelian royal line. Ethan Carter studied the extended hand in front of him with the calm focus he normally reserved for unfamiliar machinery. The light surrounding her skin was gentle but unmistakable, like a living current running through the air. He had seen enough strange technology across the stations of the inner systems to know when something was extraordinary. This was not technology. This was something entirely biological. Lyra's hand remained steady, though inside she felt the subtle tremor of uncertainty that came from challenging the rules she had lived with her entire life. Every instinct in her body expected the same reaction it always received when someone approached too closely. The energy field should surge. The air should tighten. The other person's nervous system should recoil and force them to step away before contact could ever occur. That was the pattern that had defined every moment of her life among other beings. Yet the human standing before her showed none of the usual signs. Ethan did not look uncomfortable. His breathing remained slow and steady. The energy field surrounding her pulsed again, reacting to his presence with the same strange hesitation it had shown since he stepped inside the invisible boundary. The princess spoke softly. Human, if you take my hand, the result may not be what you expect. Ethan looked up from the faint glow and met her eyes. I think the entire room is already past the point of normal expectations, he replied calmly. A few of the diplomats shifted slightly where they stood, their attention completely fixed on the space between the two figures at the center of the chamber. One of the Aurelian advisors leaned forward as if trying to measure the distance more precisely. Less than a foot separated the human technician from the princess now. Lyra felt the familiar energy field ripple along her arm. It was stronger near her hands, where the bioelectric charge tended to concentrate. For years, she had learned to keep her hands folded or resting at her sides to avoid accidental contact with anyone around her. Slowly, cautiously, she extended her hand a little farther. The glow brightened softly, spreading through the air between them like a gentle wave of light. "If you feel even the slightest discomfort," she said quietly, "you must step away immediately." Ethan gave a small thoughtful nod. "Fair enough." He studied the shimmering air one more time, then slowly lifted his own hand. His movements were careful, not out of fear, but out of respect for the strange phenomenon he was observing. The distance between their hands narrowed inch by inch. Around them, the chamber remained completely silent. The faint glow pulsed again, brighter now, as if the energy field itself was reacting to the approaching contact. Lyra watched the human's hand come closer, her heart beating slightly faster than usual. For the first time in many years, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to recognize: anticipation. Ethan's fingers hovered only inches from hers now. The glow around her hand shimmered once more, flowing through the air like a quiet current. Then the human technician paused for a brief moment and looked directly into her luminous eyes. "Ready to test your theory, Princess?" he said gently. And with that, he moved his hand forward the final inch. The distance between their hands disappeared in the quietest moment the chamber had ever known. Ethan Carter's fingers touched the princess's hand with the same calm steadiness he used when adjusting a delicate piece of equipment. For an instant, the faint glow surrounding Lyra's skin brightened, spreading outward through the air like ripples across still water. Every observer in the chamber stiffened. Several diplomats leaned forward in disbelief, expecting the familiar surge of energy that had always forced others to recoil. The princess felt the contact first as a sudden warmth along her fingertips. It was a sensation so unfamiliar that her mind struggled to recognize it. For years, every attempt at contact had ended the same way. The energy field around her body would react instantly, sending a powerful signal through the other person's nervous system that forced them to withdraw before true contact could occur. It was an automatic defense her body had never learned to turn off. Yet this time the reaction did not come. Ethan's hand remained exactly where it was, gently holding hers. The glow around their fingers shimmered once, then softened instead of intensifying. Ethan blinked slowly, studying the faint light that flickered around their joined hands. "Huh," he said quietly. "That is new." His voice carried the same mild curiosity he might have used while examining a strange sensor reading. Lyra could feel the warmth of another living hand resting against her own. The sensation traveled slowly up her arm like a quiet current, not painful, not overwhelming, simply unfamiliar in a way that made her heart beat faster than it had in years. For the first time since childhood, she was touching another person. The chamber remained completely silent. Dozens of witnesses stared at the two figures in the center of the hall, waiting for something dramatic to happen. Nothing did. The faint glow surrounding the princess gradually softened, becoming little more than a gentle shimmer around their hands. Ethan turned his hand slightly, adjusting his grip as if confirming the contact was real. "Still here," he said lightly. Lyra looked down at their hands with wide, luminous eyes. The human's fingers rested comfortably against hers, as if there had never been any barrier between them at all. "This is impossible," she whispered. Ethan glanced up at her expression and gave a small, reassuring smile. "Impossible things happen all the time when you stop assuming they cannot." Around them, the diplomats finally began to move again, murmuring softly among themselves as the reality of what they were seeing slowly settled in. An Aurelian advisor stepped forward one cautious pace before stopping again, clearly unsure whether to interrupt the moment. Lyra slowly lifted their joined hands slightly, watching the soft glow fade further with each passing second. Her voice trembled with quiet disbelief. "No one has ever been able to do this." Ethan shrugged gently, though his eyes remained focused on the strange energy field that was now barely visible. "Maybe the problem was never that nobody could touch you," he said calmly. "Maybe everyone else was just too afraid to try long enough to find out what would actually happen." The princess looked at him again, still holding his hand, as if letting go might cause the moment to disappear. And for the first time in many years, the empty space that had always surrounded her no longer felt quite so lonely. The warmth of another living hand resting in hers refused to fade, and Princess Lyra remained completely still, as if even the smallest movement might break the fragile miracle unfolding in the center of the chamber. For years, every attempt at contact had ended before it truly began, her body's natural energy field reacting instantly and pushing others away long before skin could meet skin. Yet Ethan Carter still stood there, his hand resting comfortably around hers, the faint glow that once surrounded her fading into little more than a soft shimmer in the air. The diplomats watching from the outer ring of the chamber struggled to process what they were seeing. Some leaned closer to their companions and whispered uncertain observations, while others simply stared in silent disbelief. Among the Aurelian guards, the tension had shifted from alarm to confusion. Their training had prepared them for countless dangers that might threaten their princess. But nothing in their long preparation had ever suggested that the greatest surprise might come from a quiet human technician holding a toolbox. Ethan tilted his head slightly as he studied the last traces of light fading between their fingers. The glow had not disappeared completely, but it no longer surged with the unpredictable intensity the princess had described earlier. Instead, it flowed gently around their joined hands like a calm current finding a new path. Interesting, he said thoughtfully. It looks like your energy field is still there, but it is behaving differently. Lyra slowly lifted their joined hands another inch, examining the contact with careful attention as if memorizing every detail of the sensation. The warmth of his skin was steady and real, something she had not experienced since she was a very young child surrounded by caretakers who had once believed the strange condition might fade with age. It never had. Until now. I do not understand it, she said quietly. Ethan gave a small, thoughtful shrug. A lot of things in the universe stop making sense once people assume they already know the answer. The princess looked up at him again. Her luminous eyes no longer held the distant composure of royal ceremony. Instead, there was something new there, something curious and uncertain and quietly hopeful. Human, she said softly, you speak as though this is simply another puzzle waiting to be solved. Ethan smiled slightly. That is because most problems are exactly that. The chamber lights reflected off the polished floor as a few of the diplomats cautiously moved closer to the invisible boundary that had once surrounded the princess like an unbreakable wall. They stopped several feet away, still unwilling to test the phenomenon themselves, but eager to see more clearly what had just happened. One of the Aurelian advisors cleared his throat nervously but did not interrupt. Lyra turned her attention back to their joined hands. The glow was now barely visible, only a faint whisper of light tracing the edges of her fingers. For the first time in many years, she realized that the empty space that had always surrounded her might not be permanent after all. Ethan finally released a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. So, he said gently, looks like the station did not just need its ceiling fixed today. The princess allowed herself a small smile, the expression soft and genuine in a way that few outside her closest circle had ever seen. No, she said quietly. It appears something else may have been repaired as well. The quiet smile on Princess Lyra's face lingered for several seconds after Ethan Carter spoke, but the chamber around them was no longer silent. The diplomats who had once stood frozen now whispered to one another in careful, astonished voices. What had begun as a simple diplomatic ceremony had suddenly transformed into the most unexpected scientific mystery any of them had ever witnessed. At the outer edge of the circle, one of the Aurelian advisors finally gathered the courage to step forward a single cautious pace. He did not cross the invisible boundary surrounding the princess, but he leaned slightly closer, as if trying to study the phenomenon more clearly. Your Highness, he said carefully, the court scholars will require an explanation for what we have just observed. Lyra did not release Ethan's hand immediately. Instead, she looked down once more at the contact between their fingers, studying the warmth that still traveled quietly through her arm. The faint shimmer of her energy field had almost completely faded now, leaving only the soft glow of the chamber lights reflecting across her turquoise skin. For the first time since she could remember, the space around her felt normal. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, still standing comfortably beside her with his toolbox resting against his leg. He looked around the chamber at the dozens of curious faces watching them and gave a small, amused breath. I feel like everyone here thinks I just performed some kind of miracle, he said. Lyra looked up at him again, her expression thoughtful. Perhaps you did, she replied softly. Ethan shook his head lightly. I fixed a ceiling emitter. That is the only thing I officially came here to do. A few of the diplomats exchanged puzzled looks. The calm practicality of the human technician felt strangely grounding compared to the enormous implications of what had just occurred. The Aurelian advisor cleared his throat again. With respect, human, the contact between you and the princess contradicts centuries of biological observation. Ethan glanced down at the princess's hand still resting in his own, and then looked back at the advisor. Well, centuries of observation usually mean centuries of people assuming the same explanation without testing a different one, he said. Lyra slowly loosened her grip, but did not completely withdraw her hand. The warmth remained even as their fingers shifted slightly. Human, she said quietly, there is one possibility you have not considered. Ethan raised one eyebrow. Which one is that? Her luminous eyes reflected the starlight above as she spoke. The possibility that it was not my condition that changed. It may have been the way someone finally approached it. The chamber grew quiet again as those words settled through the room. Ethan studied her face for a moment, recognizing the deeper meaning behind what she had just said. For years, everyone around her had approached with caution, fear, and distance. Those instincts alone may have shaped how her strange energy field reacted to them. Ethan had walked forward without any of those expectations. To him, she had simply been a person standing beneath a broken piece of equipment. Ethan finally released a slow, thoughtful breath. So you were saying the problem might never have been that nobody could touch you. Lyra nodded slightly. It may have been that no one believed they could. Around them, the diplomats exchanged new whispers, their earlier disbelief now shifting into thoughtful curiosity. The impossible moment they had just witnessed was no longer just a mystery. It was the beginning of a question that might change everything they believed about the princess who had once stood alone at the center of an empty room. The quiet realization that had settled over the chamber did not fade quickly. Instead, it spread slowly through the gathered diplomats like a new gravity, pulling every thought in the room toward the same question. If the centuries-old assumption about the Aurelian princess had been wrong, then everything they believed about her condition would need to be reconsidered. Princess Lyra stood calmly in the center of the chamber, her hand still lightly resting in Ethan Carter's, as if she was testing whether the contact would vanish the moment she stopped paying attention to it. It did not. The warmth remained steady and real. Around them, the faint shimmer of her energy field had almost completely disappeared, leaving the air between them clear and ordinary. For the first time in the history of Orion Gate, the princess was not standing alone in the center of an empty space. Ethan shifted slightly and glanced down at their hands again. He was not uncomfortable, but he was beginning to realize that the moment had grown far larger than the simple maintenance task that had brought him here. He cleared his throat gently. I am starting to think I should have requested overtime pay before walking into this room, he said quietly. A few of the diplomats exchanged surprised glances. The tension in the chamber softened slightly as the human's calm humor broke through the weight of the moment. Lyra looked up at him again, the faintest hint of amusement touching her expression. Human, she said softly, you may be the first person in many years who has spoken to me without fear. Ethan shrugged slightly. Fear usually makes problems harder to understand. Lyra studied him carefully, her luminous eyes reflecting the distant stars beyond the transparent ceiling. For most of her life, she had been treated as something fragile and dangerous at the same time, a living phenomenon that required distance and caution. Yet this human technician had approached her as though she were simply another person standing beneath a malfunctioning ceiling panel. The difference in that perspective now seemed more powerful than the strange energy field that had once separated her from everyone else. One of the Aurelian advisors stepped forward another careful pace, still remaining outside the space that had once surrounded the princess. Your Highness, he said respectfully, the Imperial Council will certainly request a formal investigation into this event. Lyra did not look away from Ethan as she answered. They may investigate whatever they wish, she replied calmly. The fact remains that nothing about this moment feels dangerous. Ethan nodded slightly. That is because it is not dangerous, he said. It is just unfamiliar. The advisor hesitated, considering that answer as if it had opened a door no one had noticed before. The chamber lights glimmered across the polished floor, while quiet conversations continued among the delegates. For years they had watched the princess from a respectful distance, believing the invisible boundary around her was permanent. Now that boundary was gone, replaced by a simple human gesture that had changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Lyra finally shifted her hand slightly in Ethan's grip, not pulling away but adjusting the contact with quiet curiosity. "Human," she said softly, "may I ask you something honestly?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." She looked directly into his eyes. "When you first walked toward me, did you truly not know what everyone else believed about me?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "No," he said simply. "I only knew that the ceiling above you was broken." For a brief second the princess said nothing at all. Then a gentle smile appeared on her face again, brighter than before. And in that moment, she understood that the first step toward changing an impossible story sometimes begins with someone who never believed the story in the first place. The gentle smile that had appeared on Princess Lyra's face did not fade as the quiet realization continued to spread through the chamber. For years, the vast diplomatic hall of Orion Gate had witnessed countless negotiations, treaties, and ceremonial gatherings, yet none of those events had ever carried the quiet significance of the simple moment now unfolding in its center. The princess still stood beside Ethan Carter, their hands resting together with a calm naturalness that no one present had believed possible only minutes earlier. Around them, the delegates continued to watch with growing curiosity rather than fear. The invisible boundary that had once surrounded Lyra had shaped the behavior of every being who entered this room. Now that empty space had disappeared, replaced by something far simpler and far more profound. The Aurelian advisor who had spoken earlier finally stepped another cautious pace forward, stopping just a few feet away from the two of them. He studied the contact between their hands carefully, as though expecting the familiar surge of energy to return at any moment. It did not. "Your Highness," he said respectfully, "the Imperial Council will wish to know whether this phenomenon can be repeated." Lyra did not immediately answer. Instead, she turned her attention back to Ethan, studying his expression with thoughtful calm. The human technician still looked slightly amused by the attention surrounding them, though his eyes carried the quiet awareness that something important had just happened. "Human," she said softly, "would you be willing to test that question with me?" Ethan raised one eyebrow with mild curiosity. "Tested how?" Lyra slowly released his hand. The moment their fingers separated, a faint shimmer of light flickered briefly in the air between them, like the last ripple from a stone dropped into still water. The princess took a small step backward. Instantly, the familiar space began to open again around her, the natural instinct of those watching causing them to pause where they stood. Ethan noticed it immediately. The chamber had unconsciously returned to the old pattern, everyone leaving room around the princess without even thinking about it. Lyra watched the reaction as well. This time she understood something she had never fully realized before. The distance surrounding her had never been created by her energy field alone. It had been reinforced by the expectations of everyone around her. She looked back at Ethan and extended her hand once more. "If what you said earlier is true," she said quietly, "then the explanation may be simpler than anyone believes." Ethan looked down at her outstretched hand and gave a small, thoughtful nod. Then he stepped forward again without hesitation. Their fingers met a second time. The faint glow returned for a brief moment before fading just as it had before. This time several diplomats gasped softly, witnessing the confirmation of what they had only begun to suspect. Lyra exhaled slowly, a breath filled with something that sounded very close to relief. "It works again," she whispered. Ethan gave a relaxed shrug. "Looks like the problem is not you, Princess." Lyra studied their joined hands for a long moment before lifting her eyes toward the gathering of witnesses around them. The empty circle that had once defined her existence no longer felt permanent. And for the first time since she had learned to live with the strange energy inside her body, the princess realized that the barriers separating her from the rest of the galaxy might never have been as real as everyone believed. The soft shimmer of light faded once more as Ethan Carter's hand rested calmly in Princess Lyra's, and this time no one in the chamber doubted what they were seeing. The diplomats who had gathered along the edges of the hall were no longer whispering in disbelief. Instead, they watched with the focused attention of witnesses observing the quiet rewriting of something they had always believed was unchangeable. The great chamber of Orion Gate had once felt enormous when the princess stood alone at its center. Now that space felt smaller, warmer, more human in a way no one had expected. Lyra looked down at their joined hands again, turning them slightly, as if studying the simple geometry of fingers resting together. The faint glow that had once surrounded her had faded to almost nothing, leaving only the ordinary warmth of another living presence. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she slowly lifted her gaze to Ethan. "Human," she said softly, "you came here to repair a ceiling panel." Ethan nodded lightly. That was the assignment. And instead, Lyra continued, "You may have repaired something far older than that." Ethan smiled faintly, though his voice remained calm and grounded. "I think what happened here has less to do with repairing something and more to do with questioning it." Around them, the delegates listened carefully. Some were already speaking quietly into communication devices, no doubt reporting the extraordinary event to distant governments and scientific councils across multiple star systems. Yet none of those distant observers could feel what Lyra felt at this moment. The warmth of another hand in hers. The absence of the invisible wall that had once defined every room she entered. Slowly she released Ethan's hand once more, but this time she did not step away. Instead she remained beside him, standing shoulder to shoulder rather than separated by empty space. The difference was subtle, yet it transformed the entire atmosphere of the room. Several of the Aurelian guards exchanged uncertain glances before relaxing their stance slightly. The princess had never stood this close to anyone for this long before. Lyra turned toward the gathered diplomats. Her voice carried across the chamber with quiet authority. "For many years you have treated my condition as an unchangeable truth. You believed the energy surrounding me made connection impossible." She paused briefly before continuing. "Today a human technician walked into this room without knowing that story. And because he did not believe the barrier existed, he simply stepped through it." The chamber remained silent as her words settled into the minds of everyone present. Ethan shifted his toolbox slightly and looked around with mild curiosity. "So what happens now, princess?" Lyra looked at the assembled witnesses, then back at the human standing beside her. "Now," she said gently, "we begin asking better questions." The stars beyond the transparent ceiling glowed softly against the endless darkness of space, silent witnesses to a small moment that would soon echo far beyond the walls of Orion Gate. Ethan Carter had not arrived as a hero. He had not come to change an empire or rewrite centuries of belief. He had simply come to fix something broken. Yet as the princess stood beside him without fear, one quiet truth lingered in the air like the final fading shimmer of her vanished energy field. He was not born to conquer the stars. He was born to remind them what hearts are for.